Conrad was not a man who liked surprises. He liked his small clinic at the edge of the mountain village, his worn leather bag of tools, and the quiet rhythm of treating animals that could not speak for themselves. He liked the smell of hay and cold mountain air. He liked knowing what each day would bring. So when the sound of heavy wings filled the sky above his village just before dawn, Conrad stepped outside with nothing but a lantern and a tired expression. There were 3 of them. Dragon soldiers. Each one was twice the height of any horse Conrad had ever treated, their scales dark as storm clouds, their eyes sharp and unblinking. They landed in the open field beside his clinic with a force that shook the ground beneath his boots. The villagers who had been awake at that hour disappeared behind closed doors without a single word. One of the soldiers stepped forward. His voice was low and flat, the way a stone wall sounds when you knock on it. "You are the one called Conrad. The animal healer." Conrad held his lantern up a little higher. "I am. You will come with us." It was not a question. Conrad looked at the 3 of them, then back at his clinic, then at the dark sky still spotted with early stars. "Am I being given a reason?" he asked. "The Queen commands it," the soldier said. "That is reason enough." Conrad had heard of Queen Sereth. Everyone in the mountain region had. She ruled the dragon citadel that sat high above the cloud line, a place most humans only ever saw as a dark shape against the sky on clear days. She was said to be ancient and proud, with wings so vast that her shadow could swallow an entire field when she flew overhead. Dragons did not ask for things. They sent soldiers before sunrise and expected you to be ready. Conrad went back inside, packed his bag without rushing, pulled on his coat and walked back out. The flight to the citadel was long and bitterly cold. Conrad sat pressed against the back of one of the soldiers, the wind cutting through his coat as the ground dropped away far below. He kept his eyes open because closing them felt worse somehow. He watched the mountain peaks pass beneath him like gray teeth, and then the clouds swallowed everything, and there was nothing but white and cold and the deep rhythm of wings. When they broke through the cloud line, Conrad saw the citadel for the first time. It was enormous. Built from dark stone into the side of the highest peak, wide ledges and open arches shaped for creatures far larger than any human. Torches burned along every wall, and the light they threw was orange and flickering in the high wind. Dragon soldiers stood at every post, and they all watched Conrad with the same flat, unreadable expression as the 3 who had brought him. He was taken through a series of wide corridors, each one tall enough to fit a tree inside, each one lit by fire and smelling faintly of ash and something older that Conrad could not name. The sound of his boots on the stone floor was very small in all that space. They brought him to a chamber near the center of the citadel. It was the largest room Conrad had ever stood in, open on one side to the mountain air, the stone floor smooth and worn. And there, resting on a wide platform of dark stone, was Queen Sereth. She was everything the story said and more. Her scales were deep green shot through with threads of gold, her neck long and her body broad and powerful even at rest. But it was her left wing that Conrad's eyes went to immediately, because even from across the room something was clearly wrong. The wing was folded unevenly, the membrane dull and gray where the rest of her was vivid and alive. It sat against her side like a broken sail. Standing near her were 4 dragon healers, each one tall and robed, their expressions carefully blank in the way of people who have already said everything they can say and none of it was good enough. One of them spoke without looking at Conrad directly. "This is the human," he said as though announcing something unpleasant. "He works with animals." Conrad did not respond to that. He set his bag down slowly and looked at Sereth. Her eyes were open, fixed on him with an intensity that most men would have taken a step back from. Conrad did not step back. "You may approach," she said. Her voice was deep and measured and very calm, the way a mountain is calm. He walked forward until he was close enough to see the wing clearly. The other healers shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "They tell me," Sereth said, still watching him, "that my wing cannot be saved. That the damage is permanent. That I will not fly again." "What do they say caused it?" Conrad asked. "The storm. 3 weeks ago. A fracture and a tear." Conrad looked at the wing for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at the healers. "Has anyone checked the blood flow through the membrane?" The silence that followed was the kind that has an edge to it. One of the healers straightened. "We are dragon healers. We have examined every." "Has anyone checked the blood flow?" Conrad said again quietly, "through the membrane?" Nobody answered. Conrad turned back to the wing. He had seen this before, not in dragons but in large birds with damaged limbs, in horses after bad falls, in animals whose healers had looked at the obvious damage and missed the quieter problem hiding just beneath it. He opened his bag and took out his tools. The court watched him in silence, waiting for him to fail. Conrad did not notice. He was already working. The chamber was very quiet. The 4 dragon healers stood back with their arms folded and their expressions carefully arranged into something between patience and contempt. The dragon soldiers near the walls did not move. Queen Sereth lay still on her stone platform, watching Conrad with those deep, steady eyes that gave nothing away. Conrad did not look at any of them. He was looking at the wing. He started at the outer edge, working slowly inward, his fingers moving carefully along the membrane. Up close, the wing was extraordinary even in its damaged state. The membrane was thin but layered, stronger than it looked, stretched between long bones that reminded Conrad of the wings of the largest birds he had ever treated, but scaled up to something almost impossible. He could feel the structure beneath the surface, the way the bones sat, the way the membrane connected to each one. He moved his hands slowly, pressing gently in places, watching for any reaction. Sereth made no sound. Whatever pain she felt she kept entirely inside herself, which Conrad had learned was the way of creatures with great pride. He had seen it in horses, in large dogs, in elk that had walked on broken legs for days before anyone found them. The ones with the most dignity were often the hardest to read. He worked his way toward the intersection of the wing, the area closest to her body where the largest bones met. This was where the fracture had occurred according to the healers. He could see it, a thickened area where the bone had tried to knit itself back together over 3 weeks. That part was healing, slowly and imperfectly, but healing. But something else was there too. Conrad stilled his hands. He pressed very lightly with 2 fingers against the spot just below the main fracture line and felt it. A small hard shape, separate from the bone, sitting just beneath the surface of the surrounding tissue. He pressed again, more carefully this time, tracing its edges. A fragment. A piece of bone that had broken away during the injury and drifted slightly, and then settled exactly where it should not have settled. It was not large. It was no bigger than one of Conrad's knuckles. But it was sitting directly against a vessel, one of the main pathways that carried blood out through the membrane. Conrad straightened up slowly. He turned and looked at the 4 healers. "There is a bone fragment," he said. "Just below the fracture point. It is pressing against the primary vessel on the inner wing. The membrane is not receiving proper blood flow." The eldest healer, a tall dragon with silver along his jaw, looked at Conrad with an expression that was not quite a frown but was close to one. "We examined the fracture thoroughly," he said. "The fracture, yes," Conrad said. "But the fragment is below it. It would be easy to miss if you were focused on the break itself. We know what a wing looks like from the inside, human?" Conrad nodded once. He was not interested in arguing. He turned back to Sereth. "The membrane is not dead," he said to her directly. "It looks dead because it is being starved. The blood cannot move through properly because of the pressure from that fragment. If it is removed carefully and the vessel is given time to recover, the membrane should regain function." The chamber was very quiet again. Sereth looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable in the way that very old and very powerful things often are. Then she spoke. "Should," she said. "Should," Conrad agreed. "I will not promise you more than I can see. But what I can see tells me the wing is not finished. It is waiting." One of the younger healers made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "This creature treats farm animals. He is telling us that our queen's wing is waiting." Conrad did not turn around. He kept his eyes on Sereth. "Every healer in this room told you the wing was dead," he said quietly. "I am telling you it is not. One of us examined the whole wing. The others examined the part they expected to find the problem in and stopped there." The silence after that was sharp. Sereth's eyes moved slowly from Conrad to her healers and then back to Conrad. Whatever she was measuring in that moment, she took her time with it. "Tell me what you need," she said. Conrad opened his bag and began laying out his tools on a clean cloth beside him. They were simple tools, the kind built for careful work rather than impressive appearances. Thin probes. Small clamps. Curved instruments he had made himself over the years for working in tight spaces on large animals. The healers looked at them the way people look at something they do not understand and do not want to admit they do not understand. "I need the room quieter than it is now," Conrad said. "I need a steady light on the inner wing. And I need everyone who is not helping to move back." Nobody moved at first. Then Sereth spoke one word. "Back." Every healer and every soldier in that chamber took 3 steps back in the same instant. The silence that followed was total. Conrad looked at the wing again. He looked at the spot where the fragment sat, small and stubborn and responsible for all of it. He had removed fragments from horses, from dogs, from a large bird of prey once that had flown into a cliff face in a storm. The principle was the same. Find it, free it, give the body what it needs to remember how to heal itself. The wing was not dead. It was waiting. Conrad picked up the first instrument and began. The first thing Conrad did was nothing. He stood beside the wing for a long moment with his instrument in his hand and did not move. The healers watching from the back of the chamber probably thought he was uncertain. He was not. He was doing what he always did before any difficult procedure. He was going through it in his mind step by step before his hands touched anything. He was making sure he knew the order of things and the reason for each one. Then he began. The fragment was small, but it was deep, tucked beneath a layer of tissue that had tightened around it over 3 weeks. The body always did that. It surrounded foreign things, tried to wall them off, tried to manage them. It was a reasonable response. But in this case the body had walled off the fragment in a way that made the pressure on the vessel worse, not better. Conrad had to move through that tissue carefully without disturbing the vessel itself. He worked with a thin probe first, feeling the edges of the fragment, mapping exactly where it sat and which direction it had angled in. He did not rush this part. Rushing this part would mean surprises later, and surprises in this kind of work were never good. Sereth did not make a sound. Conrad was aware of her eyes on him the entire time. Most animals he treated could not watch him work. Dragons apparently could, and Sereth was watching with the full weight of her attention in a way that a lesser man might have found unbearable. Conrad simply registered it and kept working. If she could endure the pain, he could endure being watched. The tissue around the fragment was tight and stubborn. Conrad used a curved instrument to ease it back slowly, working in small movements, pausing between each one to check that he had not shifted anything he did not want to shift. The vessel was close. He could not see it directly, but he knew exactly where it was from his examination earlier, and he kept that knowledge in the front of his mind with every movement he made. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. One of the healers at the back of the room shifted his weight. Conrad heard the faint scrape of claws on stone. He did not look up. The fragment was beginning to loosen. He could feel it, a very slight change in the resistance beneath his instrument. He moved more slowly now, not less. This was the part where patience mattered most. He had seen less careful men rush at this stage because they could feel the end coming, and rushing at this stage was how things went wrong. He breathed steadily. He kept his hands steady. He worked. Sereth exhaled once, a long slow breath that moved through the chamber like a warm wind. It was the only sound she made in all that time. Conrad glanced up at her face briefly. Her eyes were half closed but still fixed on him. There was no panic in them. There was pain, yes, deep and controlled, but no panic. He found that steadying in its own way. She was enduring her part. He would endure his. Another 30 minutes passed. Then the fragment came free. It was a small thing to look at. Conrad held it up in the thin clamp and examined it for a moment. Pale, slightly curved, no larger than his thumbnail. It had caused all of this. 3 weeks of a dead wing and a silent court and healers with nothing left to offer. One small piece of bone in exactly the wrong place. He set it aside on the cloth and turned his attention immediately to the vessel. This part was different work. Gentler, slower. The vessel had been compressed for 3 weeks and the tissue around it was stiff. Conrad used the smallest instrument in his bag, working with the lightest touch he had, easing the pressure away from the vessel walls in careful stages. He could not force this. He could only remove the obstacles and give the vessel the space it needed to remember what it was supposed to do. He worked for another hour. The chamber stayed completely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to have quieted. The torches on the walls burned without flickering. Conrad was aware of none of it. He was aware only of the wing, the vessel, the tissue beneath his hands, and the slow, careful logic of the work. Then he stopped. He straightened up, set his instrument down, and looked at the inner wing. For a moment there was nothing. The membrane was still gray and dull, still the color of something cold and without life. Conrad watched it and kept his breathing even. Then, at the very outer edge of the membrane, something changed. It was subtle. A faint deepening of color, just at the tip, as though something warm had touched it from the inside. Conrad watched it spread, slowly, unevenly, the way color returns to cold hands held near a fire. It moved inward by degrees, hesitant at first, then steadier. Green. Faint and pale, but unmistakably green. The color of life returning to something that had been very close to losing it entirely. Conrad heard the silence in the room change. It became a different kind of silence. Not the silence of waiting for failure, but the silence of people who have just seen something they did not believe was possible and have not yet found the words for it. He turned and looked at Sereth. Her eyes were fully open now. She was looking at her own wing, at the color spreading slowly through the membrane, and her expression had shifted into something Conrad could not entirely name. It was not joy exactly. It was older than joy. It was the expression of something returning that had almost been surrendered. She did not speak. Neither did Conrad. The wing said everything. The citadel was not built for humans. Conrad understood this within the first day of staying. The corridors were too tall, the doorways too wide, the stone too cold underfoot, and the chamber they gave him to sleep in had a ceiling so high that the torchlight never quite reached it. The bed was a pile of folded cloth that someone had clearly assembled in a hurry, placed in the corner of a room that smelled of ash and old stone. The food they brought him was plain and served in bowls large enough to bathe in. He did not complain about any of it. He was there to do a job and the job was not finished. The fragment was gone and the color had returned to the membrane on that first evening, but returning color was only the beginning. The vessel needed time to fully recover. The tissue needed to soften. The membrane needed to rebuild its strength slowly and steadily before it could be trusted to hold under the pressure of flight. Conrad had seen animals improve quickly after a procedure and then collapse because they were pushed before they were ready. He was not going to let that happen here. So every morning before the sun had fully risen above the mountain peaks, Conrad was already at Sereth's side with his bag open and his tools laid out. He checked the vessel first, pressing carefully along the inner wing to feel the pulse of blood moving through it. Each morning it was a little stronger, a little steadier. He adjusted the splints he had constructed from materials the citadel had provided, light but firm, shaped to hold the wing in the correct position without putting pressure on the healing tissue. He made small changes each day based on what he found, tilting one support slightly, loosening another, always watching how Sereth responded to each adjustment. Sereth bore all of it without complaint. She was easier to work with than most animals Conrad had treated, which he found both impressive and quietly amusing. She stayed still when he needed stillness. She shifted when he asked her to shift. She did not flinch when he pressed into tender areas, though he could see in the slight change of her breathing that some moments cost her more than she showed. On the third morning she spoke to him while he worked. "You come very early," she said. "Light is better in the mornings," Conrad said, not looking up from the wing. "And the wing is more relaxed after rest. Easier to read." There was a pause. "You speak about my wing as though it thinks," she said. "Everything heals in its own time and its own way," Conrad said. "I just try to understand what it is telling me." She did not respond to that, but he had the sense she was turning it over in her mind. The healers were not warming to him. They came and went from the chamber at various hours, observing his work with expressions that ranged from blank to openly dismissive. The eldest one, the silver-jawed healer whose name Conrad had learned was Dravath, watched him most often and with the least patience. On the fourth day Dravath spoke loudly to one of the younger healers just inside the chamber doorway, not quite looking at Conrad but making sure his voice carried clearly. 3 weeks of proper dragon treatment could not fix it, Dravath said. Now we wait 12 days for a creature who wraps bones with sticks and cloth and calls it healing. The younger healer made a sound of agreement. Conrad finished what he was doing before he spoke, because he had learned long ago that responding in the middle of careful work was how mistakes happened. 12 days, he said simply without turning around. You are welcome to count them. Dravath said nothing more that morning. The court whispers were harder to avoid because they were everywhere. Conrad heard them in the corridors when he walked to the chamber. He heard them from soldiers standing near doorways. He heard them from the attendants who brought his food. The queen had lost her senses. The queen had placed the dignity of the dragon throne in the hands of a village animal doctor. When the human failed, as he surely would, the shame would belong to Sereth. Conrad heard all of it. He said nothing to any of it. He had learned early in his life that whispers were loudest when people were afraid, and fear dressed itself up as mockery because mockery felt safer than admitting you did not know how something would end. Everyone in that citadel was afraid. They were afraid their queen would never fly again. They were afraid of what a flightless queen meant for all of them. Conrad understood that fear even if he had no patience for what it made people say. He kept his focus on the wing. On the 7th morning the membrane had deepened from pale faint green to something richer and more vivid. On the 9th morning Conrad pressed along the inner vessel and felt a pulse so steady and strong that he allowed himself a single slow breath of relief before moving on to the next check. On the 10th morning Sereth flexed the wing slightly for the first time, just a small careful movement, and the membrane held its shape without any sign of tearing or collapse. That evening she spoke to him again, quietly, after the healers had gone. You have not asked for anything, she said. No payment. No promise. No reward discussed. Conrad was packing his tools into his bag. I was not brought here to negotiate. You were brought here because we had nothing left, she said. You stayed because you chose to. Conrad closed his bag and looked at her. The wing was not finished. I told you that on the first day. Sereth looked at him for a long moment. No, she said quietly. You did not give up on it. Conrad picked up his bag. Come morning, he said, I want to try a wider flex. He walked back to his cold stone room and slept better than he had in days. The 12th morning came in cold and clear. Conrad was awake before the sun touched the peaks. He sat on the edge of his folded cloth bed in the dark and went through the plan in his mind the way he always did. He had been building toward this morning for 11 days. Every small adjustment, every careful check, every quiet conversation in the early light had been moving toward this one test. Today he would know if the wing was ready. He picked up his bag and walked to the chamber. Sereth was already awake. She was always awake before he arrived, which he had stopped being surprised by several days ago. She watched him come in with the same steady eyes she had watched him with since the very first morning. The torches in the chamber burned low and orange, and the light they threw made the gold threading in her scales look warm and deep. Conrad set his bag down and did his checks without speaking. He pressed along the vessel. Strong and steady, the best it had felt in all 12 days. He ran his hands along the membrane from the inner edge to the outer tip, feeling for any stiffness or cold patches that would tell him something was not right. The membrane was warm and even throughout. He checked each splint one final time, then began removing them slowly one by one, setting them aside on the cloth. When the last one was off he stepped back. How does it feel? He said. Sereth shifted the wing slightly, a careful internal movement. Different, she said. Lighter. Any sharp pain? No, she said. Pressure. But not pain. Conrad nodded. Pressure was expected. Pressure meant the membrane was working, responding to its own weight, doing what it was built to do. Pain would have meant something else. I want you to extend it slowly, he said. Stop if anything feels wrong. Sereth extended the left wing. It moved outward in a long smooth arc, the membrane stretching wide, the bones tracking exactly as they should. Conrad watched every inch of it, his eyes moving from the inner joint outward along each bone, checking the membrane for any sign of pulling or uneven tension. The faint scar that ran along the lower section of the membrane was visible in the torchlight, pale against the green, a permanent mark of what had happened and what had been overcome. The wing reached full extension and held. Conrad let out a slow breath. The healers had come in quietly sometime in the last few minutes. He had heard them enter but had not looked away from the wing. Dravath was among them. Conrad could feel the particular quality of his silence, different from the others, heavier somehow. Both wings, Conrad said. Sereth spread both wings at the same time. The chamber was large but she filled it. The full span of both wings stretched nearly wall to wall, the right wing vivid and strong as it had always been, and the left wing beside it, steady and full and alive. The membrane caught the torchlight and held it, the color rich and even from edge to edge. Nobody in the chamber made a sound. Conrad looked at it for a long moment. Take her to the open ledge, he said quietly to no one in particular. The soldiers moved without being told twice. The main ledge of the citadel was a wide platform of stone that jutted out from the mountainside into open air, used for arrivals and departures, edged by nothing but sky. The wind was steady up there and cold, and it moved through Conrad's coat as he stood to one side and watched Sereth walk out onto the stone. The entire court had gathered. Conrad did not know when they had come or who had told them, but they were there, lining the walls and the inner archways, soldiers and healers and attendants, all of them still and watching. Dravath stood near the front with an expression Conrad could not read. Sereth stood at the edge of the ledge and looked out at the sky. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through her scales and lifted the edges of her wings slightly, as though the sky itself was asking her a question. Then she opened both wings fully and stepped off the ledge. For one single heartbeat she dropped, and Conrad felt something tighten in his chest. Then the wings caught and she rose. She went up fast and clean, cutting through the cold morning air above the citadel, banking left in a wide arc that brought her over the peak and then back around. The left wing held through every turn, through every shift of angle, through every adjustment she made against the mountain wind. The scar on the membrane caught the early sunlight as she banked and it glowed faintly, pale and quiet, a mark that was part of her now. She flew for a long time. The court watched in complete silence and Conrad watched with them, his bag at his feet, his hands still, his eyes on the sky. When she finally came down she landed on the ledge with a steadiness that sent a low vibration through the stone beneath everyone's feet. She folded both wings and stood for a moment facing the open sky. Then she turned. She walked past Ravath. She walked past the healers. She walked past the soldiers and the attendants and every member of her court without stopping, without looking left or right. She stopped in front of Conrad. And then Queen Sereth, ruler of the Dragon Citadel, ancient and proud and powerful beyond anything Conrad had ever stood before, lowered her great head until it was level with his chest. The court went absolutely still. Conrad stood and looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and placed one hand very gently on the side of her head, the way he did with every animal he had ever brought back from the edge. "You did the hard part," he said quietly. "You trusted the process." Sereth raised her head slowly. "You did not give up on what others had already abandoned," she said. "That is not a small thing, Conrad." He picked up his bag. Around him the court was silent, and in that silence there was something that had not been there 12 days ago. It was not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was something closer to the feeling a room gets when something true has just been said out loud for the first time. Conrad looked at Sereth one last time. "The wing will need monitoring for another month," he said. "I can show one of your healers what to watch for." Sereth held his gaze. "Or," she said, "you could stay and watch for it yourself." Conrad looked down at his bag. Then at the sky. Then at the queen who had just flown again after everyone had told her she never would. He set his bag back down.